Okay, let's go ahead and get started. We do have a number of members that are online, and then we have some that will be joining us a little bit later as well. We have been very busy at work since our last time. We've gone ahead and finished up our community engagement for our consolidated and module 3 efforts. So we're going to have an opportunity to share what we heard from that endeavor with you. And then we've also identified, as a result of those community outreach efforts, as well as all of the conversations that we as the Citywide Advisory Committee have had, we've identified some key ideas that we would like to talk about so that we can make sure that we vet those into the final document before we get it submitted in February. So we'll go ahead and kick it off. Lindsay's going to give us a brief overview of what community engagement looked like for us. Then we're going to have Lena and Deanna kind of walk us through some of those key ideas that we'd like for further discussion to take place. Then we're going to talk about that we have one last Citywide Advisory Committee meeting in January before we all part. And then we will talk about exactly what that process and procedure looks like as we move forward from here. So I will go ahead and kick it off to Lindsay.
Thanks, Andrea. So I'm going to go and just kind of take us back to when we started this project. I wasn't even here when some of this project started. It's taken several years, and super proud of this entire team and department and city that's really taken a lot of resources and folks to come together to get us to a point that we're at now. And we're excited to finally get it to the finish line. So this is just a brief overview of the entire process. I'll have more details as I'm trying to calculate everybody that we heard from, all the different outreach that we did, but this is just kind of a big picture, quick numbers. We've had about 29, almost 30 community conversations that we've been out talking to folks and residents. We've had 23, I think I'm almost correct on that, of this advisory committee meeting, which is once a month pretty much, which is right on par. We've done 5 different surveys throughout the community, getting almost 7,000 responses. We've had 35, and I know that number is even more than that, stakeholder meetings of our partners throughout the community. We've gone in front of city council 7 times, and then in front of all of our commissions and committees over 12 times throughout this entire process as well. So that's just a quick overview, and I'll have some more details before our next one. Just kind of a good recap of, a several year process. It doesn't happen often, and there's a large community outreach effort that takes place, as well as internal. We just want to highlight that and celebrate some of those victories as well. So as a recap to our last round of community engagement, it was focused on module 3. We did 5 that were kind of focused all around the city at our local high schools and also at our Ada County Library. And then when we did one online as well. We also did some outreach events just with some stakeholders. We did, several of you are involved with our neighborhood associations, and we joined them for a really well-attended and great conversation with our neighborhood collaborative visioning group. We went to a Boise State Urban Studies class. We presented to the ULI Developer Product Council and also spoke with Marissa and some folks with the Safe Streets Advocates. This is also just ones that people asked us to come present, or we reached out to them. There have been lots of emails, phone calls, and other kind of short presentations as well. But these are just ones that we sat down for probably over an hour at least to kind of have a conversation with these folks. So as we had these 5 community conversations, we did a short 5-question survey as people entered in, just so we could get a good idea of who's attending our events. We probably had about 65% of folks take the survey. So that gives us, it's not 100% accurate, but at least a good representation of what we know. So that's just a couple of the stats that we grabbed was about 80% of folks are homeowners. And with that, 8% of them live in a single family home. We heard from 10 of 11 planning areas. So that's pretty good. We had good representation from everywhere in the city. About a quarter of the folks that we heard from were 55 to 64 years old, and about 19%, which is the second highest, were between 34 and 44 years old. So I'm going to go over just a couple large themes and then a few smaller themes that we heard as well. And then we can stop and hear any other information that you guys might have heard in front of the community or things that we might have touched on. So just some large themes that we heard. We really had a lot of conversations about the neighborhood meetings and developer meetings that occur before development, and making sure that those are quality are really key to success in creating great projects. There's also quite a bit of discussion about standardized form that we've even talked about here, that if, you know, a neighborhood puts together the comments that they heard, maybe the developer signs off on it and then submits that would be on the record, just to create more of a formality so folks feel comfortable of like, yep, this is actually what was said. So there's lots of discussion around that. And I know our group has continued to keep that conversation going of what might be included in that form. The second one is consistent, predictable public hearing process for all parties. So just understanding, you know, if you're a neighborhood association, when will you be involved in the process? If you're maybe a developer or it's a smaller project, what that process looks like, and everybody feels a little bit more comfortable if they know what their expectations are. The Interdepartmental and Agency Review Committee, really positive feedback on that overall, making sure we're having more conversations versus just some of the transmittal that we currently do. So lots of continued conversation. I know we've had meetings with our partners as well as ACHD, and they're also very receptive to some of those conversations and what that might look like. So this kind of has a lot on it. I'll start with the first one. We did have comments that came in focused around module 1, module 2, which we were happy to receive. We tried to keep it focused to module 3, but there were some folks that showed up talking about 5G cell tower ordinance and where it's currently located. You might not be aware, but a year ago, there's a code amendment that took place, and there were just some folks that showed up with concerns around that. And we passed along that we would have our legal team look into it. And that's currently still where that kind of sits right now. In one of our first neighborhood conversations, you know, a lot of folks spoke up because we do have quite a bit of weight in our neighborhood associations. They're a valuable part of our city and in part of the development process, but we also understand that they're not completely a full representation of our neighborhoods. So there's just a couple concerns about that folks had. The hearings examiner, quite a few questions just on details. Who is that type of person? Are they a contract worker for the city? Is that a public hearing process? So a lot of people interested. And as Andrea kind of alluded to a couple of times, other jurisdictions use that. And we've used it in the past with the reemergence of that hearing examiner for this code rewrite. Collaboration with other partner cities. We're constantly meeting and discussing with the county and the other cities and kind of making sure they understand the direction that we're headed. The community development tracker that we've gone over with you guys, everybody's been really receptive to that. I think that'll be a great tool for the city moving forward. And I think we even have some short-term goals of what that can do and long-term goals that maybe it's probably going to take more time to build out, but where we're at right now, we're really happy and kind of feeling really good about the direction that that's headed. Consideration for keeping neighbor notification for type 2. That's just kind of one of the details that we received as we broke out those different application types. These next two kind of go hand in hand, and Andrea, let me know if I'm missing anything on this. Concerns about when is the appropriate time in the process for information to become public. And we kind of heard about this, I think, from Shellen and maybe a few other developers too, of, you know, before a neighborhood meeting, if they feel like a project is public, is that maybe the right place or right time when they know their project could change a ton? They might not want to receive negative feedback quite yet, or they don't feel comfortable sharing that information. So trying to hear both sides of it as well. And then that last comment about standardized form for neighborhood and developer meeting, we heard quite a bit as well, lots of discussion, and we'll look forward to that conversation in the future. And so that's kind of it on community engagement. If anybody has any questions or thoughts before we move on to other topics, we're happy to take those now. Oh, one other thing while I'll go back. We'll have our full outreach summary report probably ready in the next 2 weeks. We'll make sure we email that to you guys and give any other key updates that we might have for you before our January CAC meeting, because we're working on a few details for that meeting and any other council presentations that this team will probably have in the upcoming weeks. So anyways, yep. Nothing on Zoom yet either. If not, and we can come back to this too. If there's any other questions or comments, but that's just kind of a general overview of module 3. And then Deanna, I'll click next if you want me to.
And so the next part of the agenda, and I think Lena and I both can tag on this, but really we want to have more conversation with you all. We have on the screen some prompts of things we've heard, and we want to use this as a citywide advisory group to talk about these issues as the staff. We're going back. I think we mentioned this last time we met. We've been going back once a week through the code, almost going page by page, considering all of, reevaluating, kind of making sure the code's working. And so we have some other important topics that have come up since, as we've been going through this and as we did the module 3 outreach, even just some of them directly coming from you all. So I think we want to just pause and have a conversation about them before we move kind of into finalizing the document. I'm going to go over all of them, and then maybe we could stop and talk about whatever kind of jumps out to you. So the first was and this was actually Shellen just emailed us, I think last week, but we received some feedback on the affordable and sustainable incentives. As many of you know, when we did the revised module 1 and 2, we tied increases to density or allowances for different product types to the requirement for the provision of income restricted affordable housing and following certain sustainable development requirements. So we've tied them together. We've received some feedback that, that while that's admirable, it might not actually be it might be too difficult. So is it worth separating it, doing a and or kind of situation where you can provide affordable housing or build to these high sustainable development requirements? We've also heard some feedback on not necessarily our rental area median income limit, which is for some of ours is 80% of the area median income or 60%, but we have an ownership opportunity in there, which is at 120% of the area median income. We've received some feedback about that specific number. So wanting to have a conversation of if anyone has insights into, what is the market providing, what's accessible in terms of getting a mortgage for those ownership products. And that's typically where we got that number from, because it's tied to the ability to take on a mortgage. Then we've done some minor changes to industrial zones. I guess maybe it's better just to stop. Let's stop at that and see if anyone has any ideas about the affordable and sustainable incentives and things of that nature, if you've heard feedback from your communities.
Hi there, this is Brad Nielsen. I was wondering about sustainability and who's responsible for that. I mean, how is a developer responsible for sustainability? And what do you mean by sustainability? Is that, utilities, schools, hospital care? I mean, how does a developer have anything to do with that? And shouldn't that come before a development?
Yeah. You could go ahead, Tim. So I can give you the specific requirements we put into the code, which was one that it needs to be clean energy. So it either has to be all electric, the development. So a developer chooses what the energy source it's going to use. So it has to be all electric or geothermal, so not using natural gas basically in the development, which that's what our climate action division has told us is one of the single best things we can do to reach our carbon emission goals is to use a clean energy source. So that's one of the requirements, though developers feel different ways about the provision to be all electric. One is then incorporating water saving. Water is the other one. Incorporating water saving measures. So they need to show us that the development is going to use, I think it's 15% less water. It's projected to use 15% less water than a typical development. So whether it's water efficient resource or appliances, things like that, they would have to incorporate that into their development. And the last one is same requirement, but for energy savings, so that they would have to show through maybe it's more energy efficient windows, the way they've designed it would use 15% less energy than a typical building.
Yeah, so it's not sustainability in this big sense. It's very specific that you have to incorporate measures that will address energy savings and less water consumption, which is something that, builders do, developers do, and not always. So this was intended to encourage more of that.
I understand that, and that's in the building aspect of it. But when all systems are stressed already. Just take hospitals, for instance, right now, maybe even schools. I don't see how, I'm not sure how to put it. Putting a big development in a stress situation already, saving money on arguably clean energy. There's argument on both sides of that. So I don't know if I'm making any sense here, but there's just stuff right there.
Brad, this is Lena, by the way. I don't know if I'm tracking exactly what you're speaking to, but I think it might dovetail with that. For example, if you read the city's climate action roadmap document, one of the things that it talks about is that, if we're looking to a future of trying to think about sustainability, particularly in terms of energy usage through our buildings, that there's an equity concern in the future that if we're looking at rising energy costs or rising water costs, some of those retrofits on existing homes can be very expensive. Not everyone has the ability to do those things on their own. And having those retrofits can potentially also make the resale value of a home much higher. So there's a lot of different equity concerns that can come into, if we recognize that getting sustainable building practices can be expensive and can be a barrier, and we're not really thinking about it through the lens of also having some provision for it with housing that is also affordable. Are we looking at a situation where who has access to that sustainable building practice that allows for those energy and water savings and who does not? So thinking about sustainability specifically on like a building level and in an energy level, that's one of the ways in which we're sort of thinking about, and I think some of the thinking that went into why it can be valuable to tie affordability and sustainability together rather than making it an either or.
Go for it, Marissa. Oh yeah. And we have a couple people online too when we get to it, but.
I can see it both ways. I think one of my concerns is that if we don't have any provision in there for kind of green appliances or water saving or electricity saving, is that then that comes with higher bills for the people living there. And if they're already in housing under the affordability section, it means that income is limited as it is. And then they also get to have inefficient appliances to increase their bills. So maybe there's some happy medium that can be reached there.
This is Byron. I just had a question about the pushback or the questions that you all received on the 120% AMI for the ownership model. What were people pushing for? Lower AMI? Okay. Like by a substantial margin?
Yeah, so we heard a lot that they feel that affordable income restricted housing is 80% and below, and it even should be that way for an ownership product. That was the critique we heard.
Yeah, okay. I mean, there are just some limitations. This seems obvious to anybody in the building industry, but there, for affordability requirements, there are just limitations to what it costs to build a home, no matter how basic or how small it is. For people who have been doing like accessory dwelling units, one of our smallest, housing types that you can build, it costs currently somewhere between $250,000 and $350,000 to build like a 600 square foot ADU detached. So when we're talking about housing units, and especially the ownership model, where there is no administrative oversight, there is no government subsidy, there is no grant program or anything else artificially buying down the cost of construction and therefore the cost that these units arrive to the market, there's a certain number, and that number changes every year, of course, and it's so closely tied with are tied into our local building economy because the people constructing those homes have to make a living wage. Their ability to afford to live in the city is directly tied to their job, which provides housing for everyone else around them. So there's just a limit to that. And I'm wondering if we can do a better job, not only as a group, but those of us in the business of just helping people understand the profound difference between ownership model and rental model, I guess. Not really a question, sorry, but just a suggestion.
And Patrick has his hand raised.
Thank you. I feel really super strongly about the positive value of separating the affordable and sustainability incentives. Conceptually, we have these as incentives because they are things that the city and we think are good things we want to see. And my fear with the way that is currently structured is that these good things that we want to see will rarely be used because you got to kind of do all the good things all at once in order to receive a benefit. To me, a very positive outcome would be if a large fraction of the new developments we see in the cities find that taking advantage of the opportunities provided by these incentives, providing the good things we want and receiving a benefit in return would be done on a very large fraction of the developments in the city. If the incentives were set up such that 75, 80% of new builds say, yeah, we're going electric only, no natural gas. We like the way this changes our options. That would be an incredible win. And if we said, no, you only get it if you do this and you do this other affordable thing and you have to structure your project in this way and this and that. And almost nobody used these. And we got 5 or 6 projects that use these incentives. And we have, a city that's still 70, 80% using natural gas, for example. That's a much worse outcome, and also not an enormous amount of affordable housing coming from it. So I want these incentives to be used, and I want to make them a thing that the developers are excited to take on this option, rather than a very high bar that only a few occasionally meet, and we rarely get the benefits that we would like to see from these incentives.
This is Ian. I just want to kind of build off of what everybody's saying. I think there's kind of a difference between what we're talking about with large developments and small developments. So I understand kind of the equity issues that you could run into when requiring a homeowner to renovate with these sustainable incentives. Granted, the incentives, I'm pretty sure we're talking about parking reductions, right? And what else are we talking about for these incentives, just to clarify?
So just to clarify, there's 2 kind of types of incentives. There's the more residential zoned incentives, which would allow you, if you were in one of our R1 neighborhoods, you would be able to go up to 4 units on a lot. So that's the incentive, is being able to build more units, because you're only allowed right now in an R1 zone to a duplex, or up to 2 units. So it would allow you to go up to 4 if you provide 2 of the 4 or 1 of the 3 units at 80% AMI, and then the sustainability. So those ones aren't a parking reduction. It's actually increased density. We do have that strategic infill that does have some parking reduction and also increases in density. But then the mixed use zones are essentially a large parking reduction.
With the exception of MX4, this is Tim. So when we're thinking about the affordable housing incentive, the one that we've talked about most over the summer was the actual increase in density you get if you in single family zones, and also in the MX4, if you provide affordable housing at those income targets.
Yeah, so I just wanted to clarify that for my benefit and for anybody else as we're talking about these incentives, because I think it's 2 completely different kind of scenarios, right? We have smaller developments, which are going to be more financially impacted by having to go through, sustainable, affordable incentives, which I understand that. I'm all for it, but I understand the other side of the argument. And then we have big developments, which if they're going for parking reduction, I mean, they're more able to absorb some of that cost. And from experience, I mean, we're all on a lot of these large multifamily projects, we're already doing all of those sustainable things anyway. We're already doing most entirely electric. We're putting more efficient fixtures in, stuff of that nature. So I don't think that's a difficult ask for larger developments. Then again, we're not really saying you get more density for the larger ones. It's more of a parking reduction. So I think separating those and making sure those stay separate is probably a good idea.
And there's a couple comments, and then Richard has his hand raised too. So Francis asked, is it possible to keep both the affordable and sustainable requirements rather than making them optional for new developments? And then Patrick said, I would also like to see parking reduction incentives for sustainability improvements in R2 and R3. That is a very special request. Smiley face. And Richard, go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, just a quick question about costs and electric versus gas when it comes to heating. I was under the impression that currently still that gas is quite a bit cheaper for the inhabitant. But that may change down the road, et cetera. So I'm just kind of curious where we are with that. And then also to, I guess, a little bit to Byron's comments, I'm wondering where the tiny houses would fit into this cost if we're including those when it comes to this 125% or 120% median income, or other forms of housing that are movable, containers, manufactured homes, et cetera. And obviously that's a kind of an in-between area if the land price is not included in that, but I'm not sure where the code fits into that. So those are my questions.
Well, this would apply to any house that you're building that meets those income requirements. So whether it's a ADU that you're selling, or it's you called it a tiny house, a small structure, or some of the strategic infill stuff that could include attached housing of different types, whether it's a cottage court or a small apartment building, but you're selling the individual units. In all those cases, these incentives would apply, and you would have to meet those income thresholds and it'd be 120% as currently written if it's a for sale unit.
And then,
sorry, really quick, Richard, this is Lena. Just to speak quickly to your first question. Yes, you're correct that currently to heat a home with gas would typically be quite a bit cheaper than heating it through all electric. Again, I think it's helpful to kind of look at the Climate Action Office's documents and that climate action roadmap, because they spell it out pretty well of the reasoning behind taking a shift to all electric. It has to do a lot with thinking about energy costs in the future and energy supply availabilities and shifts that are happening in electric power versus other kinds of heating and energy. So I think that's the main thing. And then also, I think, Marissa, you brought this up, that appliance really does make a big difference there as well. So there are pretty wide variability in the costs from electric energy, depending on how efficient those appliances are or how efficient the design of the home is. So that's a factor in it as well.
And actually, I just want to, and that's why we chose in the language of the incentive to say they just need to show a 15% reduction in energy use. So it's not necessarily all coming from appliance. It could be coming from the design of the building, which I think could have a greater influence on your energy costs.
Shellen had a comment online in regards to Ian's comment. She said, Ian, curious, when you talk about big projects already doing these things, I concur in regards to rentals, but not as confident it applies to home ownership.
If I could respond to that, Shellen, are you asking about condos? Because that would be my assumption, right? if we're talking about large scale developments, we're talking about condos. And
Hey, Ian, this is Shellen. You just mentioned, I just wanted to confirm I understood where you were going, because you mentioned that you thought a lot of the bigger projects already met the sustainability incentive, just sort of because they could handle they could spread out the additional costs through more units. But I guess what I'm curious about is with single family homes, I wouldn't differentiate condominiums from multifamily just because the cost would be not that much different than apartments. But like if someone's doing, a big single family home development and they're not putting any gas infrastructure in, like, is that happening?
yeah, and to respond to your question, I don't know the answer to that. I was referring to rentals, as you'd said. That being said, you wouldn't, if you're building we're getting into semantics, but if you're building a subdivision with houses, you're probably not going to be trying to get this incentive because you're not going to be asking for a parking reduction because people want to park their cars at their houses. So I don't know that it's a relevant question, but anyway.
And this is Deanna. To Ian's point, yeah, this would be for the parking reductions that Ian was referencing is in our MX zones, which we would not be supporting a large single family subdivision. And remember, those are the specific areas we want to direct our high intensity development. So this incentive would be more typical to condo product if you're doing ownership, potentially a townhome project, or larger multifamily rental.
That is the case if you're only speaking of larger scale projects, because the incentives in here are very geared towards smaller scale projects when it comes in additional density. So it would absolutely apply in those cases. I guess the differentiation we're making right now in this discussion is large scale versus smaller scale, but it certainly would apply there.
This is Patrick online. May I ask a city representative why something like the parking reduction for sustainability isn't considered in R2 and R3? From talking to developers, my understanding is that's a rate limiting step for townhouse and similar development in those zones, and we'd get some new, more moderately affordable housing components, at least less so than a single family home, that would be environmentally sustainable from that.
Can I just mention one thing before you answer about the R2 and R3? That is, the MX zones are not the only places where we're proposing parking reductions, to be clear. First of all, there's a parking reduction in all single family from 2 units, two spaces to 1. There's also parking reduction incentives associated with the strategic infill, which is a single family zone, smaller scale addition to this ordinance. And is there a parking reduction associated with going to 4 units if you do affordable and sustainable in the single family? But there's a reduction because we're going from 2 to 1. I just don't want anyone to leave here thinking the parking reductions are only limited to MX zones. That is not the case at all. But R2 and R3, you want to speak to that, Andrea or Deanna?
I think that's good feedback to say. We discussed that yesterday. Was it yesterday? We're considering that. We haven't got to that section in the code, but we did hear feedback from the community of why are there some zones that don't have an affordable or sustainable incentive, which would be the R2 and the R3. So I think that's a reasonable piece of feedback to give us to consider. Should we expand these incentives to the R2 and the R3?
And Patrick, if I could just ask a follow-up question too. So we know that we have incentives for some of our residential zones, excluding R2 and R3. We know that we have some incentives for specifically the MX3 and MX4. If we were to offer our incentives to the R2 and R3, do you think we should tie them to affordability or sustainability? Do you think we should offer parking reduction or all of the above, or are there other instances that you would think would be appropriate?
Thank you. My personal judgment, and I know that I am not the median voter, so I always keep that in mind with respect to my answers on this, but is that I think they should be titrated so that these incentives are often used because we're getting good things that we want from them. So when we tie multiple requirements together, be that affordable and sustainable or other pairs of types of requirements, it reduces the probability they'll be used. So I think targeting one key thing we want with one thing the developer would get and allow them to say, I'm going to go on this pathway and go for this incentive and get this thing is to me more likely to achieve that goal of making them used often, in which case either affordable or sustainable, and then have a meaningful incentive that makes certain types of projects more workable in those zones than might not have been before. Again, it may be an additional parking reduction, though, as Tim said, there are some already. I know that I've looked at the math of that with some developers, and one additional spot less, something may change the math, may not, but at a conceptual level, my answer is one key thing we want, one key thing they get, versus tying a bunch together in a daisy chain that may never get used.
Sorry to be so particular about differentiating in this case, but the reductions that we have for parking single family, all of the allowances that we're giving for additional density, the up to the 4 units and the strategic infill and single family, none of the parking reduction is incentive. We should never say the word incentive when it comes to the single family reductions. Those are just reductions, and it's from 2 spaces to 1 per unit. So it's not 1 space if you're doing multiple units on a single family lot. It could be 4, it could be more than that if you're doing strategic infill. But that part of it is not an incentive.
This is Byron. Can I workshop this just a little bit more? Hate to belabor a point, but if we're talking about, well, correct me if I'm wrong. So we're talking about separating the affordable and sustainable incentives, meaning that a developer would then choose one or the other, correct? And that would cut loose the density, increase.
Wait a minute. You wouldn't you're workshopping, so let's
Yeah, I'm
do that.
workshopping. Yeah.
You wouldn't choose one or the other. You would have to do both the way it's written now.
Right. Yeah. But
Okay.
if we're talking about the proposal of separating them,
Oh, okay,
is that
got
what
it.
that means? Is that okay? So, playing off of that, are there additional incentives that we haven't looked at to date that might be enticing additional incentives for anyone who does decide to tie them together? So making only one required for a density increase, but if you want to take both of them, maybe a reduction in open space requirement or something else like that might be another enticement for developers. Don't know.
And there were a couple comments from Richard that I'll just read out loud quickly. He said, if most developers meet these desirable incentives, then we should have stronger standards. The incentive should be for going above and beyond the expected. And Francis said, I agree with Richard. And Richard still had his hand raised, but I wasn't sure if you just hadn't lowered that yet or not, Richard. But
No, sorry, I'll lower it.
thanks.
Okay, well, this is Lena again. Do we can always come back to these if we want, but we'd have a couple more to get through. So if we want to move on to sort of the next point on the slide. So for industrial zones, we've heard a lot of feedback of sort of concerns and ideas about how we can improve those. And so we wanted to just kind of give an update on that. So for instance, well, I guess I'll get to T2 in a minute because that's with zone changes and that's next. There's been some concerns about light industrial uses. Richard, in particular, you've brought up some concerns about warehouses and idling trucks. And so that's, something that's still kind of ongoing, of specifically thinking about how warehouses are treated as one single use in the code as currently written. And, is that something that we should be re-examining? We also had a lot of feedback about residential use versus residential zone in terms of how we would look at buffering requirements. So do you want to, if it's all right, I could go over kind of some of the changes that we've looked at as staff in our review. And a couple of those are, we are trying to look at how we can match the requirements for buffering and mitigation, or if there are potential impacts that would restrict a placement of an industrial use. As written in the code currently, it says that if it's adjacent to a residential zone, and we would like to have that changed to reflect residential zone or a residential use on the land that is adjacent. So it's not specifically tied to zone. And that's going to take some additional work in terms of how we get those numbers exact. And so we're looking at that now. And I think that those are really the main things that have come up about concerns in industrial. And kind of tied to that is that there are a couple different changes to the zoning framework. So T2, that technology zone, and HS, the health services zone, are being brought back into the zoning framework. So that was a discussion as well that came up in industrial of T2 being consolidated with M1 into that I1 zone. And so that is being separated back out again, and we're having that separate T2 zone as we had it before in the code.
So any thoughts or questions?
I see Richard has his hand raised. Richard.
Yeah, thank you. I suppose that was inevitable. I appreciate those changes. Both of those, I hadn't thought about the health part much, but the pulling the T2 out again, I think is a really strong step in the right direction. And also looking specifically at idling diesel. And the reason for that, just to step back a moment, is that unlike many other states, our DEQ cannot regulate mobile sources of pollution. So it's really just this big empty hole, regulatory hole, that puts people at risk when you can't, when these projects, and as we know, what a warehouse is anymore is not what it used to be. So I think that's a really positive step in the right direction. Are landfills still an allowed use? I mean, a new allowed use in these industrial zones. And I ask that because that's kind of a similar issue. Idaho DEQ, which might regulate some of these industrial uses if they could. For instance, for things like PFAS, those forever chemicals. There's an interesting article in Bloomberg about a year or so ago with Idaho DEQ saying, well, we'd like to kind of discuss this with the public, but we feel we can't even mention it because of our Idaho laws. They're very pro-business and anti-regulatory. And so if we have things like landfills, where the rules are that hazardous waste can't be stored, well, it's not like something like PFAS is not currently considered hazardous, even though it's considered to be toxic at 1 drop per 5,000 Olympic swimming pools over a lifetime. It's just one of these kind of regulatory loopholes, and reflects the fact that we live in a very impoverished regulatory environment, that it puts people at risk if we have expanded industrial uses. So anything you can do to tighten that up, and I think it would be hard because, this requires specific information so often. The ideal thing is that that's all built into the zoning code, right? Because it's unreasonable to expect, our planning staff or our officials to be able to evaluate what needs to happen at a buffer between residential use and an industrial use. And a lot of that will be site specific. And so it's a very hard thing. I would suggest having requirements like, an air quality model, for instance, where you could actually look at site specific conditions and the actual magnitude of the proposed uses. And some states I know do that. Now that isn't streamlined and that isn't making things predictable, but it does deal with the actual complexity that will occur for the people who live there in the future. So I guess that's the trade-off. So thank you anyway for moving in this direction.
Thanks, Richard, for those comments. This is Lena again. And to answer your question, yes. Sorry, I forgot that change. So thank you for bringing it up. We did look at landfills as well, and I don't have the code in front of me at the moment. And that's the one thing I forgot to put down in my notes. But we did take a look at that as staff and make some changes to try to address concerns that we had heard about that. So stay tuned for that. And yeah, thanks again for your comments.
And Richard, because that was my section of expertise, they gave that assignment to me. So I-1 no longer allows landfills. I-2 would allow them through the conditional use permitting process. And there, just to give you an idea, the amount of land that is designated I-2 within the city of Boise is actually very, very, very limited. So. And then two, when we talk about the setbacks, so how does industrial and residential integrate well when they are next to one another? We evaluated and established kind of 3 tiers. So it's really based on the size of the development. So anything over 10 acres in size, we would require a 100-foot buffer between the parking, drive aisles or building from that residential use or zone. From 3 to 10 acres in size, that buffer would go down to 50 feet. And then when you're less than the 3 acres, that would go down to 30 feet. But there would always be a separation as well as a landscaping requirement to provide that visual noise abatement type buffering there. So we are headed that way to ensure that, you know, we are achieving the social justice issues, to make sure that the health implications are considered, and making sure that it's for all residents, whether it's a residential zone or use.
Yeah, so we can go on to the next one unless there's any other comments on industrial or things that folks wanted to bring up on that topic. So oh, it's right in front of me. I don't need it on my computer. So a couple other things that we have had a lot of discussion around is height limits. So currently in the MX3 and MX4 zone, there's a height limit of 60 feet. And you can go above that in the MX4 if you have those, meeting those incentive requirements. However, there's been a lot of discussion about thinking less in terms of specific foot height and more in terms of what are the types of buildings that we're really wanting to see. So in those MX zones, we're really wanting to put heavy requirements on how parking works and not wanting it to take up a lot of land use, wanting to see that parking put underneath a building, wanting those activated streetscapes. And so we tried to think about what are really the building types that we need to make that happen, and what is the height that you need to achieve that building type and building form. So still having discussions around that. And, if you have additional thoughts on it, we've heard a lot from this committee on similar topics, but wanted to open that up again. And we've also had some discussion on thinking about residential heights a little bit differently. So currently in the code, as it's written, flat roof and a gabled roof are kind of treated the same in terms of height. But some of the feedback we've heard from the community is that the massing of that building can feel really different. And so perhaps we should consider having a different height limit for a gabled roof versus a flat roof. Another way that we could potentially look at that too is thinking about things more in terms of stories rather than a specific height. So what this would mean ultimately is we would kind of have a code where we look at residential heights a little bit differently than we look at height in other zones. And so it doesn't have that simplification that can sometimes be beneficial, but sometimes we sacrifice a little bit of that simplification to really get the kind of standards that we're looking for. So that's kind of where that conversation is now. So if folks have thoughts about that, take it away.
This is Byron. I've got some thoughts about it. I just, back to the question I think we've talked about in the past, which is what are the downsides to simply just counting stories rather than a hard height? What are the, on the regulatory side of things, what is the downside to that?
You mean from an administrative standpoint? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, from the regulatory side of things. So, when I'm talking with like neighborhood groups and I'm talking with nervous neighbors, let's just call them nervous neighbors, about the height of a development or anything next door to their home, the language that they tend to speak, that vernacular really is more in terms of stories rather than an absolute foot height. Most people cannot estimate what 55 feet looks like from the ground, and that's understandable. But they do know what a two-story building looks like. They know what a raised first level looks like. They're, the comparisons, I guess, visual comparisons that are available around you if you're having those conversations in a neighborhood. All you have to do is look across the street or down the road or whatever, and you've got them right there. I'm wondering on the regulatory side of things, or perhaps on the legal side of things, is there a downside to simply just using story numbers rather than worrying about feet height at all?
I think it's just that it's a different way of doing it, Byron. I think it's a matter of we'd have to change our practice and people's comfort with administering the ordinances, but that is certainly achievable. This is something that other cities do. They use stories versus height. So it has been done. It's been done for years in places to great effect. So I think while there would be some administrative issues for us to address, they certainly can be. It's more an issue of, the comfort that we have with moving from feet to stories as a community. And that's why we're bringing this up, with you, because now would be the time to explore it.
Okay.
And I think one question we have had too internally as staff is, I think one of our goals with the setting a height limit is we want, or not, whether it's a height limit or a stories limit, we want a variety in the type of roof lines we're getting so that it's an interesting neighborhood and streetscape. So we're just, we're worried that, or curious on what's going to get us that variety that we're perhaps looking for. And I guess that's kind of something we've been struggling with, is thinking through.
And Andrea, since you've seen it all locally, is there any worry that people are going to take advantage of like a story count and try to sneak in things like mezzanines or lofts in between stories? And is that, is it easy enough just to exempt those from, in our code language, make sure that those are addressed?
That was one thing that came up in our conversations, was always the mezzanine or the loft. Typically, we do not see those in residential zones. We just don't. We've most commonly seen them in the industrial area where there is warehouse facility and they use that mezzanine or loft area for their offices. So I haven't seen it in that regard. I could see somebody doing, very, very large floor plates. And we have had a number of concerned citizens call us about very tall buildings that seem out of place within their neighborhood. In those scenarios, those have always met the 35-foot height limit that we have today in the R1C zone, and we are proposing to increase that to 40 feet. We pulled some information to look at, what are, some of our 3-story units coming in at today. We pulled some information that said anywhere from 35 or 31 to 35 is where we are my guess is that 35 is because that's where our cap is. So those may have gone taller if they would have had the ability to do so.
There's one comment from Richard, and then we have 4 hands raised online, so we can go there. So Richard's comment just said, moving from feet to stories seems counter to form-based design. So we have Kelly, and then we'll go Drew, Jessica, and Shellen. Kelly.
So Richard, actually, I was going to make a comment similar to that, because I can think of a couple of examples in our neighborhood where, we have a building that is more traditional with a gabled roof that's 2 stories. And then we have a modern structure that has, where they have the angled roof.
Sloped.
Yeah, sloped. I apologize because I don't know all the technical terms, but even though they're the same same size or height, or 2-story buildings, they look very different. How they and the one with the sloped roof is adjacent to a very traditional house, and the way the side of the building that's close to the house, there's like a flat wall, where on the other side it's, so I'm trying to get my head around, how would you make a judgment call in those, or write a code that, would get the results that we want. I mean, all the neighborhoods talk about wanting something that's, cohesive and with the character of the neighborhood, but I don't really know how you define what the character of the neighborhood is. And if it's just on stories, we have examples in our neighborhood where roof lines have a very different visual impact, based off of the architectural style.
Thanks, Kelly. Drew?
Yeah, I just wanted to express my support for especially the MX side of this. I think there's a good piece of that to make sure that the types of projects that are most appropriate for those areas are essentially allowed by the dimensional standards that we have. And I think there's enough recently completed projects that tell us what that is. And it's unless commodities and construction prices change, we're going to continue to see more podium construction. So I think the code in those areas should allow, at a minimum, probably a 5/1 or a 5/2. That gets to stories rather than height, like you've said. So I really support that direction, especially in the mixed use zones. I will say that I think the design guidelines are important, like you've said. Podium construction is cost effective, but it also comes with a lot of challenges as far as streetscape activation and the perception of the project to the community around it. Folks are quick to say, well, just put a coffee shop in it, but not every building needs a coffee shop. We'll just have to be careful about how design is reviewed for that method of construction, especially if we see more and more of it along the corridors. So generally just a comment that I support the direction you're going with that. So thanks.
We were able to pull, and this is not final data, but we were able to pull some data from 2000 onward, and we have building permit data on what the building was, how many stories the building was, and then what the height was. So when we look at a 5-story building, the average height was 71 feet tall. So just something to think about when we go, oh, is a 5-story building appropriate? We may be looking at something, on average of 71 feet or 70 feet.
And understanding how that data of a building that's 5 stories in height is 71 feet. Our current code would not allow a 5-story building to be constructed in that MX3 or MX4 zone. And so we need to look at, is that the product that we would like placed on State, Vista, and Fairview? And if it is, we need to consider allowing that height to go greater than the 60 feet that we've currently identified. And so we have pulled, some of that data. Now, again, our data doesn't tell us, are we talking about a 4/1? So that podium, because that podium always has a bit of a larger floor plate. But it does give us some good data on that area of where we need to be to hit that sweet spot to get that preferred product.
And Jessica and Shellen, and then we have a comment from Francis I can read afterwards. Jessica?
Hello. Yeah. Andrea's said my favorite word, parking structure. I would love for, as you guys are doing your analysis and considering parking structures, how they should be treated. I'm a little frustrated with the newer projects coming into the downtown core, because it's a lot of podium type projects, which I understand financially why it's going that direction. But I would like to see more opportunities or incentives or even requirements about getting some of the newer garages wrapped with retail, complete retail or housing or office, and not just on the ground floor. I was just in DC last week and was quite inspired. I was in a couple of neighborhoods that have gone through a lot of redevelopment, and these projects were probably 6 years old or less. And there's a lot of parking structures, but they were all wrapped around with housing all the way to the top. So the only reason I knew that there was parking behind them or in the middle of them is because I was on an elevated train and saw it, and just like, wow, that's cool how they treated the garage behind the scenes and put the housing in front of it. And it kind of reminded you of a city block that you would see maybe in downtown DC, or not downtown, but in DC or New York. I was in New York too. And I'd love to see some attention paid to future parking structures, and maybe we can hide them better. I know they're necessary evil, but maybe we can figure out a way to get those treated differently, instead of just like, yeah, here's your coffee shop on the ground floor, 4 levels of parking deck, and then housing or whatever on top. Thank you.
And Jessica, we have really focused on what we do for parking garages at the ground floor level. I don't know that we've fully addressed anything above that first pedestrian level, but we have described that we want to see those active uses located there, and not including stairwells, bike storage, those type things. Those have been classified or sold to our community as active uses, and those are not the active uses that we're looking for. So we have established some standards in some of those MX zones. So that should help with that ground floor level. Now, our above grade levels, we would need to look at as well. So I would encourage you to take a look at that. And if you have any suggestions, let us know.
And Shellen has her hand raised.
Hey, I don't want to take too much time, because I think most of what I'm trying to communicate has been said in different ways, but I appreciate you guys taking a look back and seeing sort of what is being built where. And I think it was Andrea that mentioned that 5-story building is coming in at 70 feet, which surprises me. I wouldn't be, I would suspect there's some more commercial and office buildings in those than residential, but I think those are exactly the kind of buildings that we're expecting or hoping or aiming to see on those transportation corridors. So if, the maximum height in those areas isn't allowing a typical 5-story building, I think there's a problem. And where I see it in my work, which is, in multifamily housing and not in necessarily luxury or high-end housing, is when we're trying to put, whether it's podium or a garage or a mix of uses, because that's what we think is either it's required, or we think that's important based on the what's going on in the area. we are often finding ourselves limited in sort of a traditional commercial space, like a restaurant, a brewery, even like a larger coffee shop. You really do need 13 feet. I think with a commercial kitchen, it's at least 13, maybe even higher. I'm not certain. An architect in the room could tell me probably, but, so we find ourselves really having to back down from that and doing, 10 or 12 feet so that we can get the units on top. And then that commercial space on the first floor becomes more like office or very small retail, like coffee shops without a kitchen or, like sandwich shops that are just, so it just limits. And that's when I think you'll find if you really want the diversity that, you were saying, not having a specific foot maximum, I think will get you more diversity overall. I don't know if that makes sense.
You have nods. Yes, Shellen. A couple comments that came in the chat. One from Francis, just saying, I appreciate the conversation and the considerations being discussed. From a personal perspective, I am nervous. I am a nervous neighbor living next to an industrial parcel. The owners of the property plan to build 5 10,000 square foot, 30-foot tall industrial buildings, 50 feet from our property line. This 35 feet may be to code, but from a homeowner's perspective, unless they design their buildings with a sloped roof or tiered building, our concern is that it will visually be extremely oppressive. We are negotiating this with them. To me, using a height reference seems more understandable than stories. And then Drew also commented, I also want to commend some of the recent design guidance and direction from the city that preserves alleys or easements downtown. Having variety on blocks simply by breaking up building massing is a great way to improve how dynamic our naturally higher density areas are. Ian.
This is Ian. I think it's interesting that Jessica brought up Washington, D.C. There's some really I lived there for a couple of years. There's some really cool architecture being built there, and they do a good job of hiding the parking. One thing I don't think they do, and this comes back to the variety of building heights, is a lot of the new developments, like in the Navy Yard neighborhood down there, they all end up being the same height. And so you get these monolithic blocks that have kind of different styles on them, but are more or less the same height. And so one thing that I was thinking about as we're talking about building height limits, and I don't know, this is necessarily what Byron wants, but it seems to me like certain zones, and that's kind of what's been proposed, maybe those zones are the ones where it's stories instead of height. Whereas more residential and areas next to residential, I think it should probably remain a height limit instead of a story limit, but that's my personal opinion, so.
Any other final thoughts on height?
This is Brad. Just throw my 2 cents in. I personally believe that it should be restricted to height. I think if we just make it levels or floors that, we can expand the ceiling on a structure, and then we're, where are we going to end up with, in height. But I'm personally working on a job right now that has a 14-foot ceiling or roof, but it's got a 25-foot parapet on it, which seems to be a crazy waste of height. And I understand hiding mechanical units and that kind of thing, but now we have a huge snow load possibility, and then we got wind, forces. I look at it from a structural standpoint, and that's more expensive. But just saying, I think we should keep it as a height limit instead of store limit. So.
Thanks, Brad.
To put in a really big, interesting switch in this, some cities actually say you can do 3 stories up to a maximum height of X feet. That would allow us to monitor some of the abuse that could occur. So that really is an option for us to consider as well. That sometimes gets a little difficult to really identify where do you draw the line of maximum building height so that we don't have those incompatibilities of sloped roofs and those types of things? But that is an option that I'd like to throw out there too, just in case somebody would like to consider that.
And then there was one comment from Shellen that came in. She still has her hand raised, but I'm not sure if it's meant to, but Hillary has her hand raised too. So Shellen said DC has an overall height limit because they protect the view of the National Mall, the Capitol, to the Washington Monument, just for perspective. And then Hillary, did you have your hand raised?
Only kind of. I was just going to back up Andrea and say that you can draft around that. I mean, as a lawyer, we draft around those types of, either or, greater of, lesser of type things. They're more of an administrative burden from the city standpoint because it's just, more boxes to check to figure out which one, whether something qualifies. But yes, I've seen that too. And I think that that's probably doable in some of these zones, especially the MX things where you're looking at where you do want to see a variety of roof lines, but but stories matter.
This is Byron. I concur. I think Andrea's proposal is really great. Unless there's a lot of additional work from city staff's perspective in terms of review, seems like a fairly easy thing to review to me, but that would kind of give us the best of both worlds.
I'm sorry, I'm not actually sure how that's any functionally different than just a height limit. If it's X stories up to a height limit, given that I'm sure the building code has a minimum height limit per story implicit in it currently. So I'm not sure how it's functionally different than just a height limit, just an actual question.
I guess it would. So if we just said a maximum of 4 stories, those could be 4 stories that have 18-foot floor plates. Or we can say you can do 4 stories, but you can't exceed 65 feet. So that there is comfort from the neighborhood side that the sky is not the limit, but it does give some flexibility for.
I just meant, how's it different than the height limit if you just did a feet one? If it was just 65 feet, how does adding the number of stories up to that limit? What information does that piece add versus just saying the feet?
And it may not add more. It may be what a neighbor is more comfortable describing, that I have a 3-story structure. Because oftentimes, as Byron had noted, a normal person typically isn't able to tell you how tall a structure is in feet.
Yeah, and I think we discussed this quite a bit, and I think maybe we got mixed too, because we were really thinking of the heights. This discussion is like, how are we approaching our mixed use zones, and is our 60-foot limit getting us the building type we want? So, we looked at our data and we're seeing that 70 feet is more likely to get us the building type we want. And then we talked about the residential heights, and that we've heard quite a bit from residents that there's a difference in feel between a gabled, kind of to what Kelly had said, a difference in feel between a gabled roof and a flat roof, and how we're now proposing to measure height in the code. We're measuring to the very top of the building. Instead, we used to measure to the very top of the building in a flat roof, or to the midline in a gabled roof. So now we're kind of creating some sort of, I don't know if it's a disincentive, but we're perhaps creating more bulk in the flat roof and less bulk in the gabled roof. So is there a question to say, should there be different height limits or different ways to measure between those roof lines in our residential zones?
Hey, this is Brad. Just curious, maybe an architect might know this, but as far as sustainability and savings in an insulated roof, I mean, a flat roof versus a gabled roof, I mean, what is there a benefit to the gabled roof?
Thanks, Ian. Not really, no. Unless you want to, so there's some, to my knowledge, LEED certification requirements that allow you to count the insulating properties of snow during the winter. That would be the only thing that would really push a flat roof over a gabled roof necessarily. And that really only gets you like some benefits for part of the year. But it really just comes down to the air in the cavity of the wall. That's what slows down the passage of heat from the inside to the outside. So not really. But I did like your point earlier, though, about the flat roof project that you're working on, because I don't know if Ian would agree with this or not, but there is kind of like, there's another fairly substantial pressure, naturally occurring pressure to keep buildings at a certain height or from escalating beyond a certain height, and that is cost. So there are construction material standards that keep certain buildings on module or according to certain modules, like the size of a plywood panel, for example. But there aren't very many people or very many developers that are interested in building a building that's larger than the one that they need. Really, we're trying to reserve space for building systems in between the floor plates. And that's a certain like comfort level that we get to when we're planning around like forced air systems and things like that. But no one wants to build a building that's more expensive than they really need. And so that's one kind of check. I guess the exceptions to that might be a skyscraper that's really trying to get to be larger than another skyscraper. And then certain homeowners I've spoken with are very concerned about the feel of their first floor. So some people really want to push their first level up to something like a 12-foot ceiling. But like even, historic buildings, a lot of the buildings we have in the North End have 10-foot ceilings. That's something to keep in mind. They were already kind of pushing the limits on their ceiling space back then, really just to keep the hot air above their head level. It's kind of the reason why they're doing that. So long answer to your question.
Yeah, I was going to say, thanks, Byron, for the education and ceiling height. Any other thoughts on the height discussion before we go on to the last item? Okay, great. So one of the last things that we've been sort of working through discussions on is drive-throughs. If you'll recall, the way that the code is currently drafted is there's a pretty strong departure from current state in terms of where drive-throughs would be allowed. They were prohibited in a lot of zones where they had previously been able to do it. So there's been some discussion about is there a possibility or an appetite to maybe expand back some of the places where drive-throughs could be allowed, say in the, excuse me, in the MX1, 3, 4, or 5 zones, if there were really strict standards about how that drive-through is completely contained within the building. It has to be in the rear behind the building. It can't be near the street or interfering with the pedestrian environment. So we've heard a lot of feedback on both sides for that. I know that, we've heard from a lot of, in our staff discussions that we're really wanting to move away from that drive-through dominant environment and really get that kind of walkable streetscape that is so much of the goals of this code. So it's very much like many of these issues, something that we've heard a lot of things from both sides, and we're still kind of working through how that would fit into the code and kind of where we come down on it. So if there are, I don't think Ben is with us today, or is he? He is. Oh, he's online. Okay, great. So I know, Ben, you've brought up some issues around this before. And so we wanted to kind of open the floor up again for that and just sort of hear feedback on what folks think, and specifically thinking about those mixed use neighborhood, and then mixed use active, mixed use transit oriented development, and then MX5, that downtown zone.
Kelly has her hand raised. If Kelly, you want to start us off?
Sure. So, so we had, a business that was proposed in our neighborhood, the CVS pharmacy that was proposed on State Street several years ago. And the major objection of our neighborhood was the drive-through. And if the entrance of the drive-through is on the back of the building, so that would prevent someone from having to, break their car on like State Street to turn into the structure to, be able to, access the drive-through, but go to the back of the building. In the case of the CVS pharmacy, well, then that meant that they would be driving, into, turning into a residential neighborhood and then entering and exiting the drive-through, through this alley area, or, basically in the residential neighborhood. There was also a proposed Starbucks coffee drive-through that was going to be on State Street. And then there was a lot of challenges as to how they were going to make that drive-through accessible, because it was going to be at a, 17th and State, where it would require people to turn left and then off of State onto 17th and then into the drive-through. And so the traffic pattern was really challenging. But also you would have, if the drive-through was in the back, is like what they proposed, then you'd have the squawk box in the back where people would be placing their orders, which would back right up to a resident. So that, for MX1 and then MX3, where they're backing those types of developments are next to neighborhoods. I don't see where the concern with that would change. And even if it was inside the building, I don't know. I'm trying to have a hard time visualizing what that would be. If you could if there's an example you could share where the drive-through was actually contained in the building, if there's one that exists in town, that would probably be helpful in understanding how that would really work. But I do know in those two cases that was the primary objection to those drive-throughs, was the fact that it was going to direct the cars back to the back of the properties, and they would be, the residents that live next to them would have cars, and the ordering and everything taking place next to their homes.
Some of the examples that I can provide for drive-throughs that have been integrated into a building would be in the downtown core. Many of our banks, so you would look at Key Bank on Capitol Boulevard, US Bank on the corner of Capitol and Front. Some of those, what we do end up with both of those particular examples are accesses to the street. So we would have an additional access to the street, which does cause issues and conflicts with pedestrians and bicyclists when we are looking at those areas. So you've brought up the MX1 zone. Our staff had some concerns with, this is where we want our neighbors to be walking, and do we want to have those conflict points? So that was an issue. It again came up when we talk about, hey, our TOD nodes in the MX4 zones, those are critical. We do not want to have those there. MX5 is the downtown core. So we've heard mixed reviews. We've heard, hey, the allowance for drive-throughs may be there, particularly when we're thinking about banking or pharmacy, not necessarily food pickup. But then we've also heard, I think this goes contrary to what the city is looking for. And so I guess we were hoping for some feedback from you guys on whether you thought it was a good idea, a bad idea. Are there instances where it might be okay? Those types of things.
So Andrea, those two examples you gave, if I'm visualizing it correctly, those are both within parking garages, correct? So for the banks that you mentioned. So so everything's kind of contained within the parking garage. The people that are accessing the ATMs are driving into one entrance of the parking garage and out another. Is that correct?
The Key Bank is situated that way. The US Bank is not. The US Bank is actually a structure. So they have their office located adjacent to those two roadways, and the drive-through is located nestled behind it.
Okay.
The goal is, I think, though, to make it so you go, oh, I think it's just inside the parking structure. Or I guess that would be, does that feel that it's addressing some of your concerns, Kelly? You're like, well, it's inside the building, right? Or it's inside the parking garage. And that's.
Yeah, it's, because now see, there's one where it's in the parking garage, and you also have that really cool bike storage area. And I'm trying to, I think it's off of Main. So I think if it's something where it's contained and it's also within the regular flow of traffic, I mean, contained where the noise or the business transaction or like idle vehicles are not, going to be something that would be interfering with the residential property, whether, next to apartments or whatever, then that might be something that would be a little more palatable. Yeah, it's just like one of the bad examples of how drive-throughs have not worked well at all is like the Dutch Brothers Coffee on State Street and 15th. That creates a traffic jam on two different streets on State and 15th in the morning, the way that one is structured. So, and it's a nuisance to the neighborhood. So, there's just a lot of trepidation with drive-throughs. I think we just need to be very careful about what it is.
This is the closest this committee will ever see me to being a NIMBY. So on this topic, I think it's generally makes for a lower quality built environment. It has a lot of externalities, as we're hearing from other commenters. The benefits, though, such as they are the consumer surplus to the convenience of the people that use them, and the increased business activity and availability, which matters to some degree. And I'm not equipped to measure that. Somebody could do an econ study of how much consumer surplus do we lose if we decrease the propensity of drive-throughs by 30%. I'm not sure how much value to citizens we lose, but from a built environment perspective, I'm kind of a NIMBY on this one a little bit, which is the only time I'll say that.
This is Marissa. I'm not in favor of increasing the areas where drive-throughs can be either. I just think that it definitely makes that car culture that we have in our country. It doesn't do anything to lessen that, and it does cause a lot of issues with emissions, people idling. There's a reason why we have these signs everywhere in the schoolyard that says "Turn your vehicle off." So I'm not in favor of them generally, and especially when they're anywhere near a residential use, just because of the noise that can happen from them. And interestingly, for impact fees for the highway district, you pay more impact fees if you have a coffee shop without a drive-through than you do with a drive-through. So to get more money for our roads, we should limit them.
All the fun facts today, Brad, and then we have a couple of people online as well.
This is Brad. One thing about being on this committee is I'm in this constant state of confusion. Where do we limit, every grocery store, every house, everything that crosses a park or a sidewalk is a potential problem for a pedestrian. I don't understand why we're, limiting, the drive-throughs. I mean, consider a pharmacy. A lot of people can't get out of their cars. Older people can't get out of their cars. So it's a convenience. Coffee shops, I mean, do we really need that many more coffee shops? And if it doesn't work there, don't put it there. I mean, are we all grown-ups here? I agree that, we don't need it so much. I mean, I get my coffee faster if I get out of the car anyway. But where do you limit these kinds of things?
Sure. And Brad, just to respond to that quickly, this is Lena again. I think you're touching on something that came up in discussion about this, even of, thinking about the different kinds of uses and how they use drive-throughs. So specifically, if we're thinking about the MX1, so that mixed use neighborhood zone, if we're really wanting to get a neighborhood sort of commercial district, trying to accommodate for drive-throughs and the types of site plans that we may need to, work with an applicant, it's really kind of working counter to the goals that we've set for that zone. But even within that, there was discussion about, well, maybe for a pharmacy or maybe for a certain kind of a use, you could see the utility of it even at like a neighborhood scale for exactly some of the reasons you're describing. But yeah, this is kind of why we wanted to open it up again, because there are a lot of facets to the issue. And just to clarify, as the code is currently drafted, I believe drive-throughs are prohibited except in the MX2 zone where they are conditional. So that was a pretty intense departure from where things are currently. And so the question on the table, just to be clear, is not, should we take where drive-throughs are allowed today and expand them further, but from where we have landed in the draft of prohibit them in all mixed use zones except for MX2 where they are a conditional use, should we consider with new ideas about how we could perhaps look at that site design, like Andrea said, having it contained completely within a building? Does that then maybe change our approach to how we would look at the use table?
And just for clarification, drive-throughs in the MX2 zone do not require conditional use as it's written. It's administratively approved, assuming that you've met all of the use specific standards. So just to be very clear.
Thank you for the correction, Andrea. 600 pages. It's very difficult to keep all of it straight.
And Ben has his hand raised first, then we'll go Richard and Hillary.
Thank you. Yeah, Ben Zamzo here. And I know the city wanted to get feedback from the rest of the committee. I've shared some of my feedback on this issue with the city directly, and Lena just brought up a really good point that what stands out to me is just the stark contrast, the intensity of the restriction of the areas that are available for drive-through use. It's now only allowed in the MX2 zone, but also with the kind of summer revision of module 2 in the zoning map, a lot of the MX2 got converted to MX3 along Fairview, State Street, and Vista. So in the current draft as written and in the current map, it's a pretty limited amount of geographic area in the city where the drive-throughs would be allowed. And any future drive-throughs that get built in the city of Boise, and you have to imagine there's going to be several over the rest of our lives and through the lifetime of this zoning rewrite, are all going to crowd into those limited geographic areas. So, we've already talked about the uses. That was one point I wrote down, that we're not just talking fast food coffee. It also has financial services, pharmacy, and a number of other retail categories that have started to use pickup and or drive through. And then as far as some examples, Andrea already mentioned the Key Bank downtown. I want to say Zion's might have an parking garage, ATM drive up as well. Panera Bread did kind of a pergola on Franklin by Cabela's. So it's not an enclosed drive-through, but it's kind of dressed up and hides the cars. And then on Vista, I know there's the Jimmy John's and the Jack in the Box, which were both built to kind of the new urban standards to put them up against the street, just if anyone's wanting some examples. I can definitely appreciate all the conversation, and I can understand, wanting to get away from the car culture that having drive-throughs allowed, reinforces. But we're talking about, on some of these areas, corridors that can handle 45,000 cars a day. So, maybe on Fairview in certain mid-block parts of let's say Fairview and 5 Mile, for example, these are very heavily trafficked corridors and will be. I think where I finally shook out on the issue is I would agree that in the MX1, drive-throughs would not be appropriate in the neighborhood setting where we're trying to really bring new commercial services and uses to the neighborhoods that haven't existed before, when a lot of those MX1s were previously LO and didn't allow commercial uses. So I think the MX1, I'm personally good with leaving the drive-throughs out. And I could also see a good argument for the community center portions within the MX3 zones. So as I've talked to Tim about, the MX3 zone really is made up of two different types of properties. There's the community centers in Blueprint Boise, but then there's also just all the transit areas that we've identified on Vista, Fairview, and State. And I think those are really different types of properties, even though they fit within the MX3. So I could see in the community centers at those really important hubs, maybe having drive-throughs not allowed, but within those transit corridors that carry a lot of vehicles and a lot of need from the consumers to have that option. I'd like to see drive-throughs allowed, provided that they are built to certain form standards that the city can agree upon.
Thanks, Ben. I know Lena, we're going to try and get her to be a co-host so she can share her screen, I think. But Hillary had her hand up and Richard as well.
Am I next? Is it me?
Yeah, go for it.
So I agree with everything that Ben said. And I will say this, I've had this particular issue stuck in my craw ever since we did the design review guidelines way back when, because I think our current standards are already too restrictive on drive-throughs. But I completely agree, with everything that's been said about the reliance on car culture. And I understand that, but there are other sort of impacts for not allowing drive-throughs, many of which Ben laid out, but someone else touched on, issues of accessibility. It was it was actually a boon during COVID. And it really isn't realistic. I mean, there are a lot of businesses that are expanding their drive-through rollout, especially on the retail side. And I understand that, people look at that and they say, well, how is this really creating value? Well, it's creating value in the form of a diversity of tenants and a diversity of services available to the community, because there are a lot of businesses that now simply will not consider space unless there is a drive-through option. And they're not willing to fight the fight with the city. So you're really restricting your pool of businesses out there that you can attract for some of these developments. And if the entire intent of this is sort of to create communities where people have access and where there's a diversity of options available, then I don't understand why we would take that off the table in all of the zones where they actually do make sense. Like Ben said, where they're the most heavily trafficked. One of the things that I do want to point out is that a lot of the way to deal with drive-throughs has been to force them into places that aren't visible from the street. And every single one of those measures does nothing but exacerbate the problems with the impacts to the neighbors and with the interaction with the pedestrian. There are ways to screen drive-throughs from the street or from a sidewalk that are much easier and less expensive than trying to figure out all of the negative interactions that happen when you force a drive-through to back up to a neighborhood, or when you try to enclose it. That's a big public safety risk. There's a lot of reasons we don't want those types of enclosed tunnels in cities. I think we're not really looking at all of the negative impacts because, this is maybe an unpleasant fact of life to a lot of people, but drive-throughs are here for now. They're here to stay, at least in the short term. And, you start restricting drive-throughs and you're going to have a lot of other negative consequences that you're not really anticipating.
I might just hop on to Hillary's comments too. I forgot one point she reminded me and it ties in. Hopefully we're successful in this city rewrite to add much more housing stock for all of the people who are inevitably going to move to Boise. And if and when those people all move here and we hopefully have new construction homes for them, we need retail to support that population. And, every retailer has a different economic model of how much volume they do, how much revenue they do, and therefore how much they can afford for rent. And it's just a matter of fact that the drive-through tenants have modeled it out that they can pay much more rent than the non-drive-through tenants. And so as we look to try to build some of these mixed use projects, the more dense projects at today's construction costs and today's land values, we need retailers who can afford to pay the freight to kick off those projects for us developers to actually bring those out of the ground. And by ruling out these drive-through tenants who can pay 40, 50, 60, $70 a square foot in rent, and you take them off the table and you're stuck trying to make your pro forma pencil with, you know, a yoga studio that could pay $17 or $20 a square foot, you know, maybe 1/2 to 1/3 of what the drive-through tenants can pay. It really makes it a lot more difficult to make some of these mixed use projects pencil.
And can I just really fast add to that, because I think there's another layer to consider too. If we're moving forward with, if we're remembering the allowed use alternative form. So now that let's think if we're considering adding back drive-throughs in, kind of exactly to Ben's point of we're going to be now requiring or incentivizing that higher intensity form. So 4 stories, 5 stories in the MX3. You know, a drive-through is going to be reviewed in that. We may not be seeing the single story drive-through, or if they are proposing a single story drive-through, it's going to be going through public hearing because it's not meeting our allowed form. So just another layer of review on drive-throughs.
And Richard had his hand raised, and there's a couple comments online I'll read.
Great, thank you. So as far as State Street is concerned, and especially State Street west of Glenwood, you know, we talk about, well, we're a car-oriented culture and we have to deal with what's real now. And I hear that a lot from people in my neighborhood when we hear that we're a best-in-class transit along State Street, and yet we don't have a bus stop for 2 miles. And yet we are approving transit-oriented densities along State Street, you know, with the hopes that someday we will have bus stops. I think we just have to be consistent here. I think that if we're going to design that cityscape for walkable local shopping, then we shouldn't just kind of think, well, we have to be realistic about drive-throughs, but not realistic about our actual bus service that we have today. So I would oppose drive-throughs along that area of State Street. It's also, you know, some of that was zoned temporarily as our new PC zone, which of course a big proponent part of that was is walkable pedestrian, right? And drive-throughs weren't allowed. So that's not necessarily a change for some of that stretch. And then also Kensington, the Glenwood, well, Gary Lane, State Street, mixed use or split use really, development. And neighbors were, you know, one of the things the neighbors were successful in getting is a lack of is no drive-throughs. And I think that the commercial there seems, you know, it certainly looks busy. It seems successful. They're all leased now, I believe. Maybe not, but it did take a while. Maybe it would have been faster with drive-throughs, but I think that was successful and is successful, not having drive-throughs. So I would say don't, you know, either we're designing the streets for the future, as we like to say, and we just have to accept that we may be suffering in the interim, both commercially and in terms of not having bus service. But I think we need to be consistent. So thank you.
Thanks, Richard. And Francis had a comment and Hillary kind of replied, but she said, is there a correlation between the number of retail spaces needed if a business does or does not offer a drive-through? And maybe staff could answer this too, but Hillary said, Francis, yes, usually they can tolerate less parking where they have a drive-through. Without a drive-through, you need more parking spaces, even for a pickup model. And then Andy just said, well said, Hillary and Ben, to those earlier comments. Oh, and I see Andy has his hand up. Sorry, I missed that.
This has been a great day and a lot of really great conversation. I truly appreciated it. if the whole public could understand what we go through in this sort of dialogue and the back and forth. One comment I want to make is that, sitting here listening to this, I'm sensing that there's the vilification of the automobile, right? Big bad car puffing out smoke, clogging up things, creating problems. And I want us to sort of put our hat on and look into the future where we are still going to have cars. Now they're just going to be electric cars. And so some of the negative impacts of the automobile world that we live in terms of emissions and things of that nature, are going to be going away. And we are going to still have the vehicles. We don't have the transit that Portland, Seattle, all of the communities that we're modeling after, if you will. And we don't have that because we don't have the density. We don't have the critical mass, and it will be quite a while before we have that. So I want to encourage us to sort of take kind of the notes from Hillary and from Ben, and the realization that, if done well, drive-throughs are a benefit. If done poorly, yeah, they're problematic, but I guess the caution is don't vilify the car, especially knowing that we're going to be going to zero emission based cars. We have them now, and more they're becoming part of the process or part of the consumer.
Yeah. Andy, just one follow up to that really quickly. And I know we got to kind of transition into our end. And I think, Patrick, you had one. Did you want to make a comment really quickly?
Hillary and Ben's comments were very compelling on the economic case. I withdraw having an opinion. I don't know what to think anymore. Thank you.
Thank you for that. And then, Andy, just really quickly to the follow up to your comment. I think it's a good one. I think just to present the sort of planner perspective a little bit, as well as that, yes, that's true. Thinking about the sort of historic impacts and externalities that automobiles bring from emissions. However, regardless of how that vehicle is powered, the way that it impacts our land use development is still going to create a lot of barriers to the kinds of walkable environments that we're looking for, kind of to what Richard was saying about trying to think of that future state of what a true TOD corridor could really look like. So yes, cars are going to be with us for a long time, even if they electrify, but many of the challenges that cars bring to getting the kinds of cities that we would like to see and be able to live in, those challenges are also going to be with us for a long time. So I just want to think about that. Thanks.
Totally agree. And I think what we start to see with Ada County Highway District and the plannings is limiting access points on and off of properties. So you limit the interaction between the automobiles. I think those are all part of a well-defined zoning ordinance also. And so again, I understand this pedestrian notion, and believe me, we've done a number of projects that are totally centered around pedestrians, and they're model projects in the city of Boise. And so I'm not saying go ahead and put a drive-through everywhere, but I'm saying don't eliminate the opportunity to do that and couch it under a pedestrian notion. Let's work with the highway district in terms of access and egresses, things of that nature.
Thanks, everyone. There's just a couple comments that I'll read, and then we'll move on to our last slide. Francis said, thank you, Hillary. It makes sense that drive-throughs would enable smaller footprints. So in that sense, it seems to be a positive despite the challenges. And then Richard said, but we are building without parking spaces regardless on these transit corridors. So with that, Andrea, close this out.
Yes, so we wanted to let you know after this discussion, we will continue to take public comment until December 15th, which is next week. Once we get all of that, we're going to do our final edits and our final pass through this document so that we have a final document that we feel good about, that we've actually researched, we've vetted, and really represents what our community is looking for. And then we're going to be able to share some of those things with you at our next January CAC meeting. And we'll be ready to submit for the zoning code amendment that we'll be requesting at the end of February. So that will be the next big release of the document. That will have given Clarion some time to make those adjustments. We'll be able to insert any diagrams or illustrations that support these notions that we have throughout the code. And then we will be moving through the public hearing process. So just because the Citywide Advisory Committee meetings will cease to exist after January, we would encourage you to participate in the public hearing process. And so we're expecting that we'll go before the Planning and Zoning Commission in April and the City Council in June. So please submit your comments and recommendations. We have been listening. We've been doing tons of research and really trying to integrate all of these ideas into the document. So if for some reason your idea or suggestion does not make it into the final document, do not feel like you cannot present that to the Planning and Zoning Commission or the City Council. You certainly have that ability to do so. So that's kind of where we're headed next and how this process will evolve and how you can participate and anybody else can continue to participate in the process. And we just thank you for being here and participating and giving us this great feedback. It's so helpful. No.
There's another slide. Andrea.
Keep going. I have one more. So we did go over those detailed processes. We will be implementing some of those IT systems. So just because we have a zoning code does not mean that everything is a go. Our zoning applications will have to change. Our workflows within our software systems do have to change. So we'll be working consistently on that to make sure that we have an effective transition once the code comes into effect. We also have some community engagement that we need to do to educate people on how to use the new code. Not only our frequent users like our developers, but we also need to educate our staff on how they can use the code and our elected and appointed officials too, because they're going to be our important decision-making bodies. So that is really critical. So last CAC meeting will be January 26th, and it'll be 2023, if you can believe that.
And our last CAC, we'd like to encourage all of you to join in person because we'll have a few housekeeping, but it'll really be a celebration and thank you for all of your time over the last couple of years. So we'll have some goodies that meeting as well. So we encourage that one to be in person as much as possible. And then there was a question from Kelly that came in about the conversion map, if that will be done by 12/15. And I think our plan, Kelly, is to release that with the draft as well. So that will come in February. So everything will be kind of be updated at once.
Oh, great. Thank you.
Yep. Any other thoughts or questions as we move through kind of the next steps? It's a long process. Okay. No other comments. Francis says, thank you and happy holidays, everyone. Thanks for coming. Enjoy the rest of your Thursday evening and we'll see you next year.